All right, so recording's going. Hello, welcome to our second class of the summer session. For today, we read the entirety of this book. And I say we, I'm curious, without judgment, who did the reading? Who read The Stranger? Everybody in class? Wow, this is really good numbers. Excellent, good job. Just to reiterate, the way that you'll get the most from this class is by doing the reading before class. Lecture is always, of course, hopefully helpful for comprehension, especially with the more complicated work. Like when we get to Kierkegaard, there's a whole lot of technical stuff going on. But it's from doing the reading yourself, sitting down and digging into these works and these words, that you will get the expression of existentialism, because it is a form of philosophy that is very much felt as much as it is thought and argued. And as well as I try to express those feelings of the problem of being, as we discussed last week, and the issues therein that come up in living a problem of being, I'm no Albert Camus by a long shot. So, reading these guys is the way to learn the most from the class. So thank you for reading The Stranger. What did you guys think? Just like starting out, I'm curious. You've read other books, I'm sure. This one's kind of weird and different. I mean, any brave souls want to share a thought about their experience? Yeah.
I think the obvious one is just the way that it's paced is so interesting, in that how it lingers on things that are completely unimportant, and then the things that are massively important are one sentence or less, and it creates this. It's really interesting how it creates this very skewed, fascinatingly confusing rhythm and flow that doesn't actually feel like a rhythm at all.
Yeah. If you've read The Road by Kerouac, that is very much like a jazz style novel. This one has a similar kind of beat pattern rhythm to it, right? But where Kerouac is poetic, none of that exists in this. You have a moment of poetry at the end, right, as the signs and stars open up to Marceau and he feels the cool indifference of the world. That might be the only poetic moment. Otherwise, you're absolutely right that the narrative structure is it's almost in your face. The character is maybe a strange sort of unfeeling person, but the way that it's written, the storytelling is almost as unfeeling as its main character. We'll talk about the style today in lecture. So good observation. Anybody else have just this is a book, as a novel, different from other things that they've read before? And I have two hands in online, so I'll take one and then we'll go in person, then back online. So Andrew, we'll do Andrew and remind me.
Will.
Andrew, Will, and then Mikey.
Yeah, to add on to kind of what's already been said, one thing that I really like about sort of the way that this story unfolds and is presented to us is it really kind of feels like things just happen to Marceau. It doesn't really feel like he's actually present for a lot of it. Especially I think about when he, I can't remember his name, but his neighbor, when he sort of kind of accidentally helps him convince himself to hurt his wife, stuff like that is where it's almost presented to us as if he is almost as much of a victim in the situation, because he didn't really mean to, but he still obviously was physically present there and also did help in those instances make things worse. And I just love that by the end of the story, kind of like you said, in those last few pages, we finally feel he's really there, he's really experiencing something for the first time. And I don't know, I think that's really interesting, really, I don't know, that's just good characterization.
Yeah, excellent. So Marceau is a main character, similarly strange and bizarre, seems to be more of the rock rolling downhill than any kind of agent, right? When does Marceau make a choice? Seems as if he's just sort of swept into the current of the absurd world in which he exists. But what I'll suggest in the lecture as I make the argument or my interpretation of the novel today, that maybe it's only once we've gone through the whole thing we can come back and start to see where there is some character and humanity if that's what it's best characterized as in Meursault. But you're absolutely right that there's a feature of this main character that is not an agent, right? And we'll talk about that too in lecture as we get into it, with respect to the difference between explanation and description, and Camus' take on these two ways of storytelling, right? Well,
I think this book is the best beginning of any book I've ever read. Just like mom died today, or maybe it's yesterday. And I just think it's so perfectly, it's like, wow, like this guy is so withdrawn and out of touch with reality. And it really sets the stage for the rest of the book with this guy's just like stone cold.
yeah, Meursault is truly an alien, right? We're not supposed to understand him. But I think the idea eventually becomes that Camus wants us to be forced to understand him. That at the very beginning of the novel, who is this person? What sort of human alien could they be? And it's Camus' goal to make us see ourselves in Meursault in the same sort of way that Meursault makes the priest see Meursault's conviction in the same sort of way. Excellent. Mikey?
So I'm a bit of a slow reader, so I'm still in the 80s in the book, the 80s pages. But I actually found it like refreshingly honest. Like I kind of liked the fact that he's like, I guess we could get married, like it doesn't really matter to me. Like it felt very honest to me. But I also kind of wonder, and obviously I haven't finished the book yet, but I do kind of wonder between the like honesty and the like removal from the expectations of society, along with all the really interesting passage where he talks about like the way my body felt, like, or the way his body felt affected his like thought process, or he's like the lights were too bright, or like it was too hot outside. And I saw a lot of like, I don't know how to put it any other way than like neurodivergent breadcrumbs. And I don't know if that was part of the character choice, like the purpose. Maybe Camus like knew someone and the book was modeled after them, but it was also kind of frustrating that everyone was constantly like, you're the devil child, you're how dare you not feel anything when your mother died. Like maybe he just didn't really, maybe it was honest, maybe he didn't really feel anything when his mother died. Maybe they didn't have a relation. Like the fact that he the way that he's treated in the book, and the way that he, I think, sometimes doesn't really know what paths to take because none of them really seem to matter to him, seem really like a great example of the times and how neurodivergent people have been treated in the past. And I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but that was very interesting to me.
Yeah, this is a really cool comment too. I'm glad you brought it up. It's something that got brought up last year when I taught this class, was the neurodivergence point, and Meursault being so alien, at least to our standards of neuronormality, or whatever we want to call it, right? Cognitive normality. And we might want to interpret Meursault as a character that is neurodivergent in seeing the absurdity and feeling the absurdity, and being closer to the reality of we're all in all the time, but we like sort of shift the world. We look at it from sideways on so that we can make it feel like something. Meursault doesn't do this. And this might be a feature of neurodivergence, right? Now, my take on this is a naive one. I think the interpretation is good, and I don't know, but my interpretation of the novel does not include an idea of neurodivergence. So like as I go through the lecture, that's just not going to be like a feature that I talk about or think about. However, I think it's like a totally interesting and valid way of reading Meursault into our contemporary interest, right? And to make sense of Meursault as a character that can help us understand our contemporary questions about neurodiversity and convergence today. So I recommend like keep thinking that because it's a cool idea. Maybe share it on the discussion board or do a write-up focusing on it. Because the neurodivergence of Meursault is a totally different way of reading the book. The way I read it has Meursault not as neurodivergent, but maybe everybody else is off, and he's the only one that is normal. It's like the world has gone crazy, and he's the only one that sees it. And maybe that's a kind of neurodivergence itself, but yeah, it's a really interesting suggestion. Thanks. So, as Will suggested, Maman died today or yesterday, maybe, I don't know. The famous first line from Camus' The Stranger. These words are iconic, right? Some of the most famous words to start a novel of all time. What do they mean? What are we to make of these words? How the story begins sets the tone for the imaginative work to be done through its completion, right? That this is the introduction to the world of Camus' Stranger, to Meursault himself, and to the events that happened therein. Maman died today, or was it yesterday? I don't know. And then several sentences later, it doesn't matter, right? So, for instance, in Anna Karenina, every happy family is happy in its own way, and in the same way, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Call me Ishmael, or we were somewhere between Barstow on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold, right? These are the powerful introducing lines to these novels that give us a story. Even maybe the story is contained in those first words themselves, that all of Anna Karenina can be seen in the happiness of families being experienced in the same way, and the unhappiness each individually, of course. And with The Stranger, Maman died today, or was it yesterday? I don't know. So I'm curious, back to discussion, what did we understand these first words to mean? How do they strike us? How do we feel reading, or was it yesterday? I don't know. Maman died today. Ryan.
Yeah, I think it really starts to instill this indifference that we're about to, I don't know, experience. And the indifference is magnitude in a way, because it's indifferent about something as mysterious and final and tragic as death, which means in a way that it's also indifferent about life itself, because we're indifferent about death. So it's going to establish that motif or that theme of indifference.
Yeah. So what might strike one as the most or the most powerful expression of indifference that you could possibly have is to be unmoved by the death of your mother, right? Maybe this isn't true in every case, but as like a general human phenomenon, I think this is like a pretty striking, telling example of indifference. Like there are those of us who may have good reasons not to be sort of struck by the death of their parent, but across the board, it is one to be indifferent to is probably really statistically strange. Yeah.
See, so this is part of the reason I had a hard time getting into the story until about like a fourth of the way through when I started to realize what was going on. Is, to me, the statement of like she died yesterday, or was it the day before? I don't know. That to me didn't strike as indifferent, rather just grieving, because sometimes trauma messes with your ability to remember. It messes with your ability to process time. And the first thing I noticed was that he had a nickname for his mom, but also didn't know how long it had been. And initially, when I read through like the first part, it didn't hit me as much as like an indifference to his mom, as much as just absolute shock.
Yeah.
And then it got to the point where burying her was less than a sentence, and I went, okay, that's wild.
Yeah. Good. So this is also like another expression of maybe the neurodivergence point, is that just the way of experiencing grief. Like maybe Meursault is truly grieving, and the whole story is just a matter of like Maman is it's like mommy, right?
Yeah.
Mommy died today, or was it yesterday? I don't know. Right.
To speak to me, like that's how I experience grief. When something's really bad, life blurs together. I don't
Shock.
process it anymore. I shut down. People are like, Ruby, you look like you're not experiencing emotion. And I'm like, I'm not, thank you for asking. And then, go back to writing the pamphlet for the funeral or whatever,
Yeah.
I don't process things. So to me, this was like, oh, finally, someone gets it.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I'm not gonna go shoot someone on a beach about it,
Yeah, because it's hot, right?
Yeah, because it's hot.
Yeah, you'd hope. But yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, right? And it sort of speaks to like, I won't again take the neurodivergence interpretation, but I think it's a totally good one for exactly this reason, and it's consistent and interesting because it is such a strange expression, so emotionless at such a powerful moment. How could it be indifference? Maybe it's just a coping mechanism or a tweak of personality to do with trauma and coping. And I think there is a way of reading the novel in that perspective that is really interesting. As I get into the lecture, I'll be taking the indifference perspective that that Marceau is not actually traumatized, but is truly indifferent. But that's not to say that the alternative is like wrong or invaluable. It's definitely interesting. And yeah, the whole grief ideas as being something different and then inspiring the rest of the novel is like absolutely paper worthy. Yeah. Rachel?
I kind of saw it as like tying in the theme of the book, because similar, like the line of like today, or was it yesterday? I don't really know. Similar to when he's in prison, and he kind of takes that like piece and being like, well, I'm gonna either die by guillotine like now or later, but what's guaranteed is that I'm gonna die. I thought was kind of mirrored with his mom, because he was like, the important part is that she died. It didn't really matter when. Kind of like same with his own conclusion.
Yeah. Because what day the dawn comes doesn't matter. What day Maman dies doesn't matter. Because at the end of the night, the idiom is like end of the day, but before the dawn comes, nobody has the right to tell Maman she couldn't be free, right? Yeah, excellent.
A couple other ways I can see it being interpreted is like kind of going along with that. Today and yesterday is just like two different perspectives. Like if he's living in the present or the past, viewing it as like a present event or a past event. And then like, like what does that mean? And then another way of like looking at it is Maman died today, but actually saying like he did, because he is like his mom is part of who he is too.
Yeah.
Which is kind of relevant because like he's like not present in the book basically in the story. Like we were talking about like agency,
Mhm.
and this is kind of cheeky, but like just we have so many different ways of like making meaning out of this sentence that's kind of like, or sentence of this first part of the book. So it's kind of like funny because it's the meaning is what you make of it, kind of like the existentialism thing.
There's a bit of irony there for
yeah.
sure. Yeah, I like the suggestion that what doesn't matter is the temporal quality of Maman's death. What do you think would be the difference to like a not stranger, normal person, and Maman died yesterday, like Maman died in the past, or Maman died in the present, like today, right now?
Like if someone who wasn't a stranger to me said that?
Well, the stranger, like, Marceau's strange, weird
Like, if
character.
anyone else said that.
Yeah. Like, why would they make that distinction emotionally?
I don't know. Maybe open it up to the class. I don't have a good answer.
Does anybody? Yeah.
I think there's different expectations of what you should be doing depending on how long ago your mother died. If it's today, there's maybe certain things you're expected to do. If it was yesterday, maybe now you're arranging the funeral more. I don't know.
Yeah, good. Which ends up being a huge part of Marceau's trial, right? Is how he arranges the funeral and who he talks to and how he sits when he like drinks coffee and smokes a cigarette casually. That maybe if we interpret this first line as it's not Maman's death that matters, but when she died that matters. I haven't thought about this before. It's a really interesting thought. The idea is that the propriety of how to treat the like ritual of burying, waking, sitting with, and saying goodbye to your mother, none of that matters, because in death, propriety ceases to have meaning, which is an interesting alternative interpretation. Cool. Mike, you had your hand up. Did you want to share?
I was just gonna say that this first paragraph immediately made me think of the fact that he's already like overanalyzing it to no purpose. But also the way the telegram was sent to him is kind of already placing him as an outsider. Like instead of telling him exactly when his mom died or being like, please come handle your affairs or something, they used the length of the telegram, which I'm pretty sure was still by character, right? Telegrams.
It's like the length of a tweet.
Yeah, they say mother deceased instead of like mother deceased and then like the date or like yesterday or Friday, and they leave this very big faithfully yours at the end instead of giving him actual like details about his mother. So it just kind of felt like very othering, like he's already on the outside. Like this is a telegram you would send to like anyone to tell them that like anyone that they know of any relation has recently died.
Yeah, that's a clever point to illustrate that they spend almost and probably more characters saying faithfully yours than to express anything about the fact of your mother's death. It already kind of speaks to an absurdity at play that we'll see throughout, or we saw throughout the novel. So there is power in the first words of this novel. And I believe that this single sentence captures the entire spirit of the story, which I'll explain once we get to the end of lecture. But first, I'll make some preliminary remarks about Camus himself as an author. So who was Albert Camus? He was born in 1913 in Algeria, which at the time was a French colony, to a working class French family. So a lot of the French colonists that lived in Algeria were very rich, right? But there was also a small portion of them who were working class, like the colonized people themselves. And this like middle group of French people who identified with Algerian culture and were not themselves dominating it, but were from a dominating class, the colonial class, created all sorts of political schisms that Camus was right up against his entire life, and lived a very challenging life in between calls for war and calls for revolution, and Camus himself always calling for peace, which ended up nearly destroying his career, saying like, look, can't we just like all be friends and work this out somehow? So Camus grew up in the wake of the First World War. His father died in the First World War when he was very young. His family didn't come from any money. His mother was a maid who provided for her children alone. And in 1935, Camus joins the French Communist Party to iron out these inequalities that I've just mentioned between the French and Algerian citizens. And throughout his life, Camus would fight both philosophically and actionably for equitable and peaceful resolution to the intercultural tensions which plagued Algeria. However, a year later, Camus left the party, which should be unsurprising as we learn more about Camus, because he was annoyed by their insistence on strictly following the ideological lines of that communist party. He basically said, look, I'm not going to believe everything that you tell me to believe because I'm a part of your party. I'm going to have my own independent thoughts, and where those thoughts align with your political position, I will agree with you, and where they don't, I will disagree. And the party said, get the heck out of our meeting hall. And so he did. This early exposure to politics and the political systems of the time would foreshadow Camus' relationship to Algeria, communism, and even to his own philosophy that everybody wanted him to believe X, Y, or Z. Camus was never all that interested in making explicit his beliefs, but rather fighting actionably to make them real, right? That we might be familiar with Camus and Sartre's disagreement. We'll talk about it more as things go on, but their big disagreement was that Camus was quiet on the Algerian question publicly, and Sartre said, revolt, like stand up for yourselves, Algerian people. But behind the scenes, Camus is writing pleas to get Algerian citizens off of death row. He wrote hundreds of anonymous pleas that eventually exculpated the citizens on death row. So after his early college life in Algeria, Camus moves to Paris to write for a newspaper, and we see the outbreak of World War II during this period. And Camus desperately tries to get home, but is trapped in Paris. The Vichy France that take over, the Nazis, right, controls his movement, and he can't go anywhere. So during the German occupation of France, Camus takes an active role in the underground resistance. He can't fight, but he can use the power of his mind and his words to write for freedom newspapers, publish documents and essays to inspire hope and rebellion in his fellow French citizens. And during this time, Camus would become very close friends with Sartre and de Beauvoir, both of whom were on our syllabus for later in the semester. And in the post-war period, Camus fought for an integrated Algeria that saw the two cultures working together to find peace and equality together. So Camus was not a fan of colonialism at all. He did not think that, look, we should have the colonial power here, nor was he a fan of the violent methods of the Algerian people who would like decimate entire villages of other Algerians for disagreeing with like the major political position. He saw torture and murder and death and war and senseless loss of human life and like physical sanctity everywhere. And it was his firm conviction that the people who loved the place and lived there and wanted it to be well should have the ability to do so. But nobody agreed with him. And so, like the pro-Algerians and the pro-French were like, screw you, dude. Like, you're not with us, you're against us, right? And so was put on the outs, was ostracized. Camus vehemently opposed the British terrorisms of the freedom fighters as well as the French nationals, and admonished both sides and became enemies of both sides. Camus was also the second youngest behind Rudyard Kipling person to win the Nobel Prize in Literature for The Fall in 1957, which we won't read for the class, but it's on the syllabus if you're interested. It's an awesome book. And in secret, Camus, under a pseudonym, wrote the appeals of over 100 death sentences given to Algerian rebels because, as he said, no life was worth the abstract cause or principle. And eventually he dies in a car crash, and there's some controversy about whether it was the communists that caused the car crash. So, there's some fun conspiracy to do if you're into conspiracies. Focus on Camus' death, not jet fuel and still beams. Forget about that one. Communists and Camus, it's much cooler. And it's during this post-war, right at the end of the war period, that Camus writes The Stranger, and eventually The Myth of Sisyphus and the play Caligula. So what Camus did throughout his career, which will be the last thing I say before we move on to the novel, he wrote in cycles, right? So he was, just consistent with the way that he lived his life. Camus was not just a thinker. He was a doer. He was an actionable person. And his actions spoke louder than his words, like with the 100+ Algerian rebels that he got off death row with his petitions, anonymous petitions. That Camus wrote in cycles that included a novel to give you the feeling of the idea that he was expressing. He wrote a work of philosophy, an essay that gave you the idea of it. And he wrote a play that communicated the same kind of content, but like in human interaction, where you communicate with bodies and with motions to actually play out the dance of the idea. And the cycle, his first cycle is The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus, which we will read, and Caligula. The second cycle is The Rebel, I think The Fall, and I want to say The Possessed, which is his retelling of Dostoevsky's story of the same name, or Devils, sometimes it's interpreted, which is Dostoevsky's certainly most political novel, and probably also his darkest, contentiously with Underground Man, but probably certainly his darkest. We're tapping into 1/3 of the first cycle of Camus' career, the novel that gives us the feeling of the concept that he completed in this entire post-war period cycle of absurdity. So what the Stranger is supposed to do is communicate to us the feeling of the absurd. We're not supposed to understand what the absurd is, but we're supposed to have it in here. And hopefully through reading the book, we do, right? That we have experienced the strangeness of Maman died today, was yesterday, it doesn't matter, of the divergence of Marceau's mind, or how he acts in the world, his non-agency, and how we expect normal agents to operate in the world. And what we'll do throughout the rest of our semester is investigate this feeling, right? So The Stranger, this first book, this first reading, gives us the feeling of the absurd, and every reading after, as we go throughout the summer, should give us more content, more concepts, more texture to take grip on what this feeling is, so that at the very end of the semester, as we're working through these jargony, complex ideas of authenticity and essence, existence preceding essence, and all this, that we have a really robust understanding of that feeling that is hopefully growing in us as we get to the final expression of it. So in order to have our best ability to work through the myth of Sisyphus, which is sort of like the mental, conceptual, philosophical construction of this feeling of absurd expressed in The Stranger, we'll need to backtrack and understand the philosophical undercurrent that exploded in Camus' absurdism and in existentialism as a whole, which will happen again in the first half of this novel. So according to Camus, quote, "The Stranger is a book about the nakedness of man faced with the absurd." And it's this absurdity that's the subject of the novel in a very particular way. Again, says Camus, "Like great works, deep feelings always convey more meaning than they are aware that they do. Intense feelings carry with them their own universe, splendid or wretched, as the case may be. The feeling of the absurd is not the same as the idea of the absurd. The idea is grounded all in the feeling. That is all. It does not fully express it," which he says in The Myth of Sisyphus. So in the spirit, we might interpret The Stranger as a book whose purpose is to convey this feeling of the absurd in order to teach its lesson, to carry with it more than it means to, because it's in us that it has its impact. That's where all the meaning is. On the other hand, however, there's still the idea of the absurd, that lesson taught in The Myth of Sisyphus, where one book is a novel and can convey feeling, the other is an essay, philosophical essay, that despite its poetry, shores together an argument. But how does The Stranger convey the feeling of the absurd, and is it successful? And what lessons do we walk away from the book having felt that absurdity? What is the absurd? There are two notions that have play in The Stranger. There's the feeling, or the lucid experience as of our existence in a factual state of absurdity. So the feeling of absurdity, the factual state of absurdity, we make this distinction, right? There are not words for this feeling, but perhaps only metaphors, right? What is it to be in a world that is absurd? This gives us the feeling. The factual state of absurdity is something like a metaphysical claim of the world, right? The world is determined by natural laws. Gravity on Earth pulls objects towards its center of mass of 9.81 meters per second. That light travels at c meters per second, right? There are certain natural laws that define the way the world works. And very much Camus is suggesting that the factual state of absurd is something like this, that the world is meaningless. The world is indifferent to us, right? The world does not have what we need it to have, which is meaning and value. And yet we need it to be there. We impose it as well as we can, and maybe surreptitiously or capriciously or as a confabulation of what the world is actually made of, maybe a confabulation. So here's what Sartre says about the factual state of absurdity, this metaphysical claim about how the world is structured as developed in The Stranger. So Sartre says, what then does absurd mean as a factual state or set of givens? Nothing less than man's relationship to the world. Primary absurdity manifests itself as a schism, the schism between man's aspirations for unity and the insurmountable dualism of mind and nature, between man's drive to attain the eternal and the finite nature of his existence, between the concern that constitutes his very essence and the vanity of his efforts. Death, the irreducible pluralism of truths and beings, the unintelligibility of reality, chance, these are the core components of the absurd. What do we make of this quote? This factual state of absurdity, the world being chancy, unintelligible, that reality is distanced from us, that there is death, and yet here we are. Do we think it's right? Is it a true statement? Or is this just the reaction to the war being destroyed after World War II?
I disagree with chance being involved, probably. But other than that, I don't think I have any big objections.
Yeah. I think that the suggestion of chance is to illuminate the idea that like we try to do things and they can fail, right? That despite our best laid plans, mice and men, they have to go right, like sort of thing. Do we think this is the right way to characterize the world? Yeah.
I really liked in the quote the part where he says like a man chases eternity, but it's like juxtaposed to our finite existence.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that describes a lot of what human action is about.
Yeah.
And then existentialism is maybe, or absurdity is kind of like realizing that that exists. And then so now how do you answer that instead?
Yeah, exactly. Our aims as people in the world, humans, are treated as interminable, meaning that when you fall in love, you don't love for some end, like for $50, right? Like, oh, you love me, here's your $50, congratulations, go on with your day, right? No, the love that you feel is supposed to be something more than the rest of life, right? It's supposed to be something that supervenes on life, but also supersedes it. It goes beyond it, becomes something that is more than just this stuff. That when we set out in pursuit of truth by signing up for a philosophy class, right? When we set out to grow our minds, we don't do so just for some material gain, some end state that, I'll get the answer I'm looking for, right? It doesn't happen, right? The reason that we pursue these goals, these reasons that give us purpose, that move us actionably through the world day by day, the reason we get up in the morning and move about our lives is not to complete, but to continue. And we don't continue. We complete in death. And this is the factual state of the absurd. Whether taken from a purely naturalistic perspective, right? That the world is indifferent to meaning, it's just a bunch of physical properties and rules that have no value in themselves, or from this more personal side, this human quality of living in that world, that we treat our existences as eternally seeking, as interminable, but they are very terminable in death, right? So the absurd man, or yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the that kind of helps me to answer a question I had in my head, because the part of that quote, did you say dualism of man and nature?
The schism between man's aspirations for unity and the insurmountable dualism of mind and nature.
Mind and nature. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes it even better. Okay, cool. Because I was trying to figure out what that means. Isn't that who said that quote?
Sartre. You have this quote, by the way, if you're interested in reading it. It's Sartre's essay on The Stranger, which comes at the back of Existentialism as a Humanism, the version that I suggested. Sorry, go ahead.
But dualism, the concept was like basically formed by what's the guy's name that starts with H?
Originally Plato, but Descartes is the one that like
Oh.
makes it explode and
Okay,
super famous.
I was wrong.
Well,
But
there are lots of people who talk about dualism, so there could
Okay.
be others.
But it's like basically like yin and yang, right? Like opposites kind of.
This is a good question. So the dualism that Sartre is talking about is certainly the kind of dualism that Descartes discusses, in there being like mental substance and physical substance. And this is what gives us what in philosophy is called the mind-body problem, that if there's mental stuff that exists out there, and there's also physical stuff that exists here, how do they interact, right? How does a thought cause a physical body to, like, I raise my hand, I think I'm going to raise my hand and then it raises, but a thought doesn't, it's not like billiard balls pushing each other. A thought has no physical material manifestation. And so it's a mystery how it's supposed to explain the movement of a physical body. And so some people deny that mental stuff exists. Some people say that it just supervenes on physical stuff. Some people say that, like David Chalmers, it goes totally crazy and says that all physical objects have properties of consciousness. Very interesting answers to this question. But what Sartre is getting at is saying, look, that what we want, what we strive for is to unify the world, is to explain it, is to like have a grand theory of physics that tells us why black holes are the way we are, and or why the black holes are the way they are, and why we have 10 fingers on our hands, all in one theory. And yet we are these things that are split in two. And how can we ever hope for a unity like that if we're mind-body things that are confused?
Okay, I really like the dualism of mind and nature, because like you said, how we have a completion when we die, but we want to continue. That's like the completion is coming from is like the mind part, and the nature part is the continuation. Because
Can you explain
nature
that?
continues. Well, we want to, like, obviously we want to reproduce and continue.
Yeah.
That's like our nature side, and then our mind, but like our consciousness ends when we die.
Yeah, so this is interesting. We strive to continue physically through the passing of our genetics, but also recognizing that, like, what's the point of any of that if I'm gone? Seems like some kind of built-in strange drive that maybe isn't mine, but is a quality of the sort of being that I inhabit. Yeah, and that in itself kind of speaks to an absurdity, right? That that as a species we have a drive that is no individuals, but is of the species. Yet we're all individuals of the species, and so are subject to it. Yeah, interesting. Cool. Will, did you have your hand up?
I don't want to rabbit hole us, but I'm still stuck on mental substance. Like, if I'm like angry, is that mental substance? The emotion in my head is angry, or if I'm like picturing my friend in my head, is that a mental substance?
Yeah, according to Descartes, both. They're just different kinds of mental substance, just
Okay.
non-physical things, thoughts, right? Ideas. If you want to talk more, we can chat more about mental substance after class. I do a lot of mind-body stuff in my own research.
Okay, I've never heard of that or dualism or whatever. So
Yeah.
I got stuck on that for a second.
The mind-body problem is a really fascinating one. How do we move ourselves at all? Is a fun one. Anybody else have a hand up before we move on? Rachel?
I thought it was interesting how he seems more moved by his body than he does his mind. Like the most upsetting part of the funeral was how hot it was. And then
Yeah.
like he keeps being like, oh, the sun made me kill that guy. Like it's the sun. And then paired with like the duality part, not so much the mind-body problem, but I feel like since he's kind of like in this state of neutrality, that's why people get so upset with him. Is because he's neither like evil or having this response to that, or like weeping and trying to be repentant. He just kind of is like, well, whatever.
Yeah,
I did a
good.
thing.
So hold on to that thought of like whether or not he's evil, because I'll break us out into group discussions and talk exactly about that. But that's a really good point. So the absurd man or hero the absurd hero for Camus is someone who recognizes the fact of their existence in an absurd condition. So his heroes is the one who says the world is absurd and I exist in the world. And they're also someone who holds on to the feeling of this state, the feeling of absurdity that comes from being such but being a human in such a world. And they rebel against it. Camus' ultimate answer to one's absurd existence in an absurd world is to rebel against it and show some form of dignity, nobility, whatever it is. We'll see whether we think that's selfish or solipsistic, but it's at least an expression of power in an otherwise powerless situation, which might be worth more than nothing, maybe, but that'll be for us to determine when we read the Myth of Sisyphus. Camus suggests that in our rebellion against absurdity, we affirm absurdity's place at the heart of our being while denying it through revolt. And in this way, our absurd heroes find dignity in existence. But is the Marceau of The Stranger an absurd hero in this way, in the way that Camus defines? Well, he's at least by the beginning of the novel, he has the makings of the absurd hero. And the first place that we become aware of the style is in the written style of the book, right? It's not just a matter of what the character does and says and experiences, but like how the book is written at all. So with respect to the style of The Stranger, I think it's more telling what Marceau doesn't say than what he does say throughout the novel, right? That the things that he expresses and thinks are almost like they're clever on Camus' part because they're indifferent to what's going on about him. And yet they still kind of point at a story happening, right? Like he's just describing being in love with Marie and on the beach and having a good time. But somehow we also, as the reader, get a sense of the fact that their tension's growing with this group of Arab men who are, you know, the brother and friends of Raymond's sister who got, or Raymond's wife, girlfriend who got beat up, right? And Marceau never like tells us about that. It's all sort of background information. So it's like what Marceau doesn't say is more important than what he does. So says Camus, the absurd hero only describes, he does not explain, end quote. And the entirety of the book remains a description of events. Every sentence seems to live in a vacuum, throttling all those behind the next into unexplained, undifferentiated non-existence. Every sentence could live as its own world. The novel is just a series of events that have very little causal connection to one another. Each could be its own world, short and punchy though the sentences are. Mullen died today, period. Or was it yesterday? It is frequently commented that The Stranger takes on an air of Hemingway in the cadence and Kafka and its intellectual timbre. And I think Sartre is right to say that Kafka's like out of this world surrealisms are something anathema to Camus' hero in The Stranger. Marceau lives directly in the world. He's not in some strange, odd, weird place where people become bugs or where like there's a court system that exists in an entire city and everybody seems to be involved with it, either as prosecutor or victim. Marceau lives directly in our world. And it's not a strange, unknown world that one hopes to break through and into, but rather one that's very recognizable, the world we live in. And it's the very same world to whom Marceau is a stranger, an outcast, an exile, an alien to us, the reader. But like Hemingway, however, the sentences are short and punchy, which was considered the American style, and Camus was almost very certainly influenced by the American style of writing at that time, which is attributed to like people like Faulkner and James and Hemingway. But why is this? Well, of course, Marceau is describing the world, not explaining it, not justifying it, because there are no justifications in an absurd world. Marceau is unattached to narrative and value in these descriptions. The sort of literary objects that might make a real story, like the feelings of a character, the sorts of objects that would explain why the events occur in the sequence they do, the motivations of a character, the character's agency, right? None of these are present. And so we have a story that's stitched together by individual worlds of sentences that don't communicate with each other, but describe little snippets of a scene, and it's our minds that put together the narrative as well as we're able to, that only communicates itself maybe a quarter of the way through the book or maybe at the end. We are afforded none of these literary objects, these normal features of storytelling in The Stranger. And remember, the novel is meant to impart to us the feeling of the absurd, but there is a lesson hidden for us as well as for Marceau in both the style by which the events develop and the factual development of events. And that is the structure of the novel storytelling. So the novel is broken up into two parts, right? And we have these two halves almost like juxtaposed to one another, experiencing different features of Marceau's descriptive quality of being in the world. So one part, the first part of the novel, sets the stage, and the second part brings the events of the first to a close. One could almost read either half without the other and walk away without having missed the message of the book, that is, to have acquired the feeling of the absurd. But together, the philosophical feeling becomes clear, that we get the content of the expression of absurdity in seeing the juxtaposition of our two parts held together. So the first part of the novel follows the life of a man who lives in the factual state of absurdity that I've described before. The second part of the novel tells how Marceau wakes up to this absurd feeling and feels it for himself, right? So part one is just an indifferent person living in an indifferent world that is absurd and just sort of being blown about, making no choices, but just living absurdly, as if Marceau were an absurd feature of an absurd world, no different from any physical, natural object, right? But in the second half of the novel, Marceau is forced to wake up to the fact of his being not a rock rolling down a hill, but a being separate from the world, and yet a part of that absurd quality and state of things. So in complete indifference to one possibility or the other, do you love me? I don't know what that means. Probably not, right? In response to Marie. Can you imagine? You're like, dating for 3-4 months and like, I love you. Do you love me? I don't know, probably not. You met, look, there's a sort of strange person, but Marceau drifts through his life in this strange way, completely immersed in his present, which I almost respect him for. There's a little quality of disturbing, like psychopathy or some quality of it in Marceau's character, but I do have some like personal respect for him in that he's like always in the present moment, right? That like he's his mom just died, but it doesn't matter because he's in love with Marie and they had like a great day going to the movies and the beach, and that whatever is present before Marceau in his present moment, he's there experiencing, whether he likes it or not. He seems indifferent to it all, but there's a lack of like anxious reflection that we probably all aspire to. Like, let's not overthink life, and there's something respectable in not overthinking as a general principle, maybe to the extreme not, but I do kind of like that feature of Marceau. So like the sentences of the novel that each contain their own distinct worlds, the events of Marceau's life move forward in analog. Nothing is digital or three-dimensional about his experience. It's only analog. It's two-dimensional. It's just presented before us. There's no feelings about it. He's indifferent to everything and almost asleep, always, save for rare moments when Marceau does feel something. Joy to kiss Marie, the heat of the sun, the cool water, the intimacy of lonely sleep in his small apartment. Yet it's these rare moments in an otherwise factual, descriptive, and unfeeling of experience of life. And we read at the outset of the book that, quote, it occurred to me that anyway, one more Sunday was over, that Maman was buried now, that I was going back to work, and that really nothing had changed. And we hope for some payoff, an explanation why Marceau feels this way or doesn't, and it never comes. We're never given Marceau's feelings in this first half of the novel. The closest that we get is the vein bulging in his head from the heat. And that's not quite a feeling, is it? Right? So we, the reader, are shocked at this kind of indifference. Like, where is the human in this character? But this is not because we're shocked only because we are not the stranger. We have feelings of our own. If it is a confabulation, we all do it. And it's pretty like nice sometimes, when your partner says, I love you, and you say, I love you too, right? Like, maybe it's all absurd and means nothing and whatever, but like, it feels good. And that is the way that we tend to live. Marceau, not so. And so his indifference might be shocking. We are not absurd heroes, or maybe we are, but generally we're not. We live our lives with meaning and narrative and value and story, none of the features that are present in the style and expression of Camus' Stranger. We explain the occurrences of events to ourselves. Why did this happen? I should have said this as I was arguing with that person before, like, oh, it would have been funny if I'd done this, in the shower, all these sondering thoughts. And so each tile of the puzzle of our experiences acquires a shape and a color to fit the rest, that we begin to patch together a life that makes sense. We create a narrative and story of ourselves. We make ourselves a character. But for Marceau, the stranger, this is not so. Experiences for him are not puzzle pieces that are made to be fit together, but rather merely events that happen in isolation of one another, each a descriptive world of its own. And it's easy to be indifferent to experiences that are had without attachment to narrative or interconnection or agency in this way. But like Marceau, we as a reader of The Stranger are left floating in this indifferent narrative that remains barely a narrative at all. The sentences drive us forward. We're forced to continue reading left to right down the page. But it's as if for no reason. Why this event rather than another? There is no reason, and yet we, the reader, hope for it. We're always looking for it. How do I get this character? How do I explain what's going on? The character isn't giving us any of that because there is no explanation. And so there are three notable events in the first half of the novel that I want to point out, and each of them is a kind of turning off of this, or close to turning off, depending on how we read and interpret it, but of this indifference as absurdity turns on. Moments that are too powerful for Marceau himself to remain aloof from, indifferent to. And he's forced by his nature as a human and as a character to feel and be, right? To not just float through, but to be committally in those moments. And yet the world remains for him, as it always has, meaningless. So he sort of snaps into being in these three moments that I'll describe, and yet the world remains meaningless, which might lead to the actions that follow. Which is to say that there are three moments in which Marceau's indifference becomes external and remote to him, in which the world becomes indifferent to Marceau as opposed to Marceau indifferent to the world. And Marceau finds himself burning with what can only be passion that finds no texture to take grip within that indifferent world. That the tables are turned, right? Oh, how the turntables. That is to say, these moments oppress him. And the first of these is the pallbearing of his mother. The sun scorches the tarred earth. He can neither be hot outside or sweat and take on a chill in the church. There's no right option. An old man collapses, presumably the fiance of his now dead mother. The sun is relentless. Marceau's temples burn. And then the second of these moments occurs in Raymond's apartment. Is Raymond a friend or a degenerate? Has the wine gone to Marceau's head? Or does he feel committed to his neighbor? And so he writes the letter. And before the third moment, a quote from Camus. Awareness of the absurd when we first claim to deduce a rule of behavior from it makes murder seem a matter of indifference. To say the least, and hence possible, there is no pro or con. The murderer is neither right nor wrong. We are free to stoke the crematory fires or to devote ourselves to the care of lepers. Evil and virtue are mere chance and caprice. This comes from the Rebel. So with that quote in mind, the third moment is the final event of this first half of the novel, Marceau's senseless murder of the Arab man. It was then that I realized you could shoot or not shoot. The blinding sun reflects from the water, which would paralyze Marceau, but instead thrusts him forwards. The sun was the same that day as it had been the day I buried Mama. And like then, my forehead especially was hurting me. All the veins in it throbbing under the skin, it was burning, which I couldn't stand anymore. That made me move forward. And here's an explanation, for maybe the very first time in the novel, that he's explaining why he's moving forward. He's not just saying, I moved forward, or I was moved forward. It's that the sun beat down on me and the veins burst in my forehead in the same sort of way that it happened the day Mama died, and that is why I did it. These explanations are fleeting, few, but in the crisis moment of the novel, the moment of murder, and not just of murder, but of the 4 shots that go into the body of the dead man after, we have an explanation, something different from the rest of the book, something that looks human, but very remote from human all at the same time, right? Like murder is evil and awful, right? But still, like finally, we're given the payoff. We're given an explanation, a feeling. We see into the character as this flip-flop of absurd world and indifferent world switch between the two. So Marceau explains away the pressure of absurdity that bears down upon him. And rather than face it, he allows it to work its way through his arm and down his hand, and ultimately to pull the trigger once and then 4 more times after the thud of the man's lifeless body hits the sand. The sun made him do it. Is Marceau guilty of the senseless murder? What do you think? Let's break up into small groups. I want to know what you guys think. Is Marceau guilty? So I don't know, like 4 or 5, and let's see how many people we have online. 3, 6, 9, 12. So I'll split you guys up into like 3 groups online, and we'll come back in like 4 or 5 minutes, maybe a little less. Can I do this? Will it work? All right. Go forth and prosper. Whatever's natural.
Yes, natural.
It's big or small, whatever.
I'm very curious if anybody thinks it's not guilty, because I have a hard time understanding the argument.
I'd probably go not guilty.
Okay.
Manslaughter.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by guilty. If you mean guilty as in more.
Good. Okay. So recording again. I want to start with online groups. What did we think? And by the way, Mikey asks, guilty legally or morally? And this is an excellent question. But what did you guys talk about? What were some opinions that we discussed online? Andrew.
So one of the things that we brought up that I think is interesting, and it kind of is in regards to whether or not he's guilty, but I was sort of like looking at like the description of like the absurd hero, and sort of like the big part of it is like recognizing that you like live in an absurd world, and then like choosing to like rebel against the absurdism, I guess. And it just makes me wonder what would have gone differently if, you know, at the end of part 1, before he murdered the guy, if he would have somehow recognized the absurdity of the world then, instead of like, you know, after the priest comes to him and he denounces God and knows that he's going to die soon, like, would that have been different? I don't know. That's like, I'm answering your question with a question, but that's like kind of what I want to ask everybody.
Yeah, now we're getting into philosophy. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It's one that I wonder every time I read it. Is, you know, like you have this realization at the end of the novel as he opens himself up to the cool indifference of the world, and you think like, oh, he figured out what he was supposed to figure out. He had his catharsis moment, like whatever, you know, hero returns to the known, new and powerful, right? But couldn't any moment from the novel have done that for him? Like, why do we have to go through all of these terrible moments and eventually like a terrible crime to get there? And if, I think the really interesting question is if, say, say we take like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence where the world happens over and over, but for whatever reason, Marceau in the second pass has this awareness of like his cool indifference to the absurdity of the world. At the second pass, does he still pull the trigger? Does the heat of the sun still pull him to commit the murder? And I'm not certain. I'm not sure there's an answer to that question, that you could go one way or the other, but I'm curious, but does anybody else you have thought?
I kind of want to bring in the presence idea again, because said before that you liked the lack of anxious reflection, and like, yeah, so like basically he wasn't really reflecting at all until the very end, and so maybe he didn't even realize, you know, that he was taking part in this because he wasn't reflecting on himself. And I had like a better way of saying that, but I had 4 hours of sleep last night, so.
Just reading all night, huh?
No. Yeah, I think maybe that has like something to do with it. Like I see like a pattern there of like being present and like reflecting, and then like
Yeah. So what might be the difference in Marceau in like the last lines of the novel and when he shoots the man on the beach is a matter of reflection, right? Is being aware, which is in fact what I'll suggest, of the fact of the absurdity of his existence. And we see in the final lines of the novel a kind of rebellion. I should only hope there's a crowd that's raging and screaming with hate, right? To know that it was all worth something, right? That I'm happy, right? But does the fact of reflection change the action itself, or just how one understands the action? So does Marceau still shoot the man on the beach and then 4 more times into the dead body, but feels that, this is all I needed, as opposed to like, it's hot and my veins are beating in my forehead, right? I think it's a really interesting question. And I think you're right, the reflection is what's different, but does the reflection do enough to create actionable change in how one lives in the absurd? And that I don't know.
guilt.
Yeah, would it make guilt? I don't know if Marceau as a character is capable of guilt. Maybe only of redemption. I'm not certain. Like, I don't get any guilt from him at the end. Like respect for Maman, but yeah, he, like, never seems to feel bad about what he did. He just wishes he could leave and smoke a cigarette. Yeah. Well, how about online? Anybody else? Let's see. We have Ryan and then Mikey, and then we'll switch to some in-person comments.
Yeah, on whether he's guilty or not morally. I mean, if the world is meaningless and there is no morals naturally occurring in the world, and they're all arbitrary and aleatory, then how could he be guilty of anything morally? But at the same time, I feel like we kind of know he's guilty, and I think he kind of knows he's guilty too. I mean, he doesn't appeal, I don't think, ever. He says, yeah, I did the thing. He doesn't feel guilty about it in like a moral sense, but I don't know. I think there's like a kind of, I don't know, a contradiction or a schism.
Yeah, good. So another expression of this absurdity, right? Between this time not between features of Marceau and the world of the stranger, but between the reader and the book The Stranger. This is like, again, like giving us as a reader the experience and the feeling of the absurd, that we see in Marceau no guilt, or at least if Camus done his job, we might see no guilt, and yet we feel that he must be, right? And here's the schism of the absurd. Good. Yeah, interesting. Mikey?
I'm still thinking about it.
Okay, raise your hand whenever, if you'd like to again. What about in class? What do we talk about? Is Marceau guilty? Yeah, Dylan.
Well, we asked, is he an evil man?
Another good question.
And we don't believe that he was evil in the sense of doing evil as he goes. He was the most honest person that I've ever read about. But at the same time, he has no morals. There's no right or wrong to him.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes him evil or not, but we never really came up with an honest answer for that.
If only we had Marceau to help us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, do these pants make me look fat?
No.
Thank you. Right? Exactly. So it's the same sort of idea that maybe honesty and morality come apart, and that in a world indifferent to us, where there is no morality, the best one can do is to be honest. And yet, does that really make us feel good? No, right? Like said, yeah, you look positively terrible in those pants. It feels kind of sad. So is the sadness and our desire for a world that can be unified, that should be unified, our need to make meaning that matters to us, right? That's valuable to us, not just like the meaning that makes the world profane and explicit, but good and worth living in. Is that something that we can get from the world? And it looks like, at least for Marceau, it's not. The best that Marceau can get is I think you're right, honesty. And though that may look evil to us and to everyone around him, especially the priest, especially everyone in the court, especially everyone who goes to his eventual execution, at least what honesty affords Marceau in the end, if Marceau truly is a stranger and an alien and something very far from human, but truly an absurd hero, is an equanimity, a coolness, that fresh feeling of a summer night. You know, the indifference to the absurd is something that is worth having, or feels good if it's not worth having. But again, that's pretty strange to us who are living in the actual world full of ideas of morality and how to treat one another and ourselves. So yeah, interesting idea. I like the honesty idea. What else? Is he guilty? Yeah, Ruby?
We basically immediately agreed yes. And I think the thing is that he would admit it himself. You know, he basically walks into court and goes, yeah, child, I don't know what you want from me.
Yeah.
Because he's an honest man. He's honest to himself. He's honest to others. He just says, yeah, I killed him. I don't know what you want. And if it's a question of just simplistic, did he do it or not, then yeah, but that's why we went to, is he evil? Because guilt implies, reason or intent. If it's just simple yes or no, then of course, he'll admit it. So that's why we started asking the question of, okay, well, was it a crime, or did he do something evil? Did he do something good? Or,
Yeah.
And I think that in that sense, it's a he did a bad thing, but also I can't say it's evil because he didn't have any intent. He just kind of did. There's no motive, there's no reason, he didn't think about doing something. He just kind of did it. And in that way, like it feels difficult to ascribe like any sort of ideals onto what is just something he did because the sun was hot.
Yeah.
I had some, I don't know where I was going with that, but
That's great. Just real quick, I'll let you respond. Is what I'm hearing is guilt in a legal sense. Yes, I committed the act, says Marceau. But then is the act evil? Well, sort of what the legal system is supposed to help us distinguish between is like, did I kick the puppy or did someone take my foot and throw it at the puppy, right? And it's the intention that draws the difference. But there's certainly no tractable intention, at least recognizable intention in the murder. There's certainly the commission of the act, right? But is the sun made me do it like someone taking my leg and throwing it into the puppy? And where we land on the evil question is, an interesting one. And maybe it's honesty. Maybe it's a kind of dishonesty and not being able to respond to the sun. But I think that's exactly the right way to think about it is commission, sure, but moral weight and direction. How do we feel about that, right? And how can we even evaluate it? These are interesting thoughts. Yeah, and you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, I got really excited because the way you were describing him doing that action really made it sound like like that's how you would describe anything in nature killing you. And so it was like he's just like being a force of nature. And yeah, and then when you add that to the interpretation of the first bit being like I died today or yesterday, like his mind did basically, so he's just not there, he's just like a piece of nature.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I like the suggestion that Marceau, though committing the act, commits it in the same sort of way that the cue ball hits the rest of the billiard balls on the first strike, right? That it just happens. He's a force of nature. And it's not until that second half, that realization, that Marceau becomes something more than just a force of nature. Or if not a force of nature, then completely prone and limited by the effects of nature on him, just blowing him about, heating him up too much, cooling him off, giving him a cool sweat, right? But yeah, I think this is the right way to think of Marceau in the first half of the book as something inhuman, right? But can something inhuman be rightly called guilty?
Got a hand in the center.
Yeah. Tyler.
Yeah, just on that comment about sort of the inhumanness of the action, would it be possible, this wasn't something we talked about in our breakout group, but would it be possible that he's not guilty by way of insanity?
Yeah, but I don't know if he would himself like admit to that. Do you think that he would allow his lawyer speaking for him is like, I did this and that, right? Like he speaks for Marceau in the first person.
Well, I mean, I think if he's just being honest and the son did make him do it, like that sounds like an insane person.
Yeah, it does. It does. Okay, so the reason that sort of defense exists is in part because of pity, right? We pity people who are not in control of their own cognitive faculties, and so are, so to speak, caused to do harm, not of their own volition, but of some external, weird neurocognitive problems that cause the to lose inhibition and do harm. Do you think, so say like this happens, Marceau's lawyer brings up the insanity defense. Do you think that Marceau is a pitiable character? So if not, like if the question is not a matter of guilt, but of sanity, is Marceau pitiable in the way that would maybe justify like part of the moral side of that defense?
Well, I don't know if pity would be the right, exactly like the right term, but I mean, I don't really pity too many like crazy, like criminally insane people, but in his own words, he's kind of convicted himself of being insane. Like the idea of the sun being hot as a motivation for murder. Like, I don't know exactly that it's only pity that is the crux of the insanity defense.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
It just seems like a fact as opposed to like oh, let's let him off the hook because of like this or that.
Yeah, you would want the jury to like be committed to the person's actually being crazy too. And it seems to me that Marceau is pretty lucid for the craziness of his causes, like why he does what he does. He seems, when he does speak, to be pretty straightforward, honest. It sounds like.
I don't think is there something about like someone being classified as insane that means they're not honest?
No, I suppose not. Yeah, it's an interesting point. We have a few hands coming up, but first, Giancarlo, did you bring enough ice cream for the rest of the class?
What's up?
Did you bring enough ice cream for the rest of the class? No.
Yes, taking orders.
Great. Okay.
Put the order in the chat.
Let's do Rachel, Delwyn, and then Mikey, and then William.
I think he's a pretty bad dude, besides the Merc. Like, he hangs out with abusers. And not just like hangs out with them, but is like, yeah, he beat his girlfriend, but like she did cheat on him. And I was like, really? Like, he's taking an active role more so than this like passive, like the narrative of passivity. Like, you are choosing to hang out with this guy. And like even I don't know, the scene where his boy is like beating someone up, and then they go outside to see the inevitable conclusion. Like, not only does he do nothing, but like, unlike the dog, when the dog's being abused and he just like doesn't leave the house, he's just like, oh yeah. And then he does go outside to be like, this is a thing happening, like this is a bad thing, but then stands by and waits for a cop to get there. And I mean, when he's like, I don't like cops, I mean, neither do I, but like, do a thing, probably.
Yeah.
And then he's like, yeah, let's vacation with him. Just like, I lost a lot of sympathy for him. And this
Yeah.
whole like passive bystander stuff. I'm like, nah, son.
Yeah, that there might be an interesting feature of guilt, not even like the murder is not even the thing that he's most guilty for. The thing that Marceau may be most guilty for is exactly what the court is saying. Is that, look, that they don't know about the beating and stuff as associated with the crime, but it's the same sort of force of nature stuff that is pushing Marceau into murdering a man on a beach that causes him to fraternize with wife beaters and partner violence executors, right? It's terrible. That sure, Marceau is indifferent, and Marceau doesn't care whether something is good or bad because he has no sense of it, but in being indifferent in that way, being swept along, is swept into pretty awful circumstances. It's not like he's being swept into happy-go-lucky sunshine and daisies. He's being swept into writing a letter to convince people that like a beating was justified and to justify the beating itself, right? To allow it to precipitate and occur. And that is not just a kind of sweeping along that maybe we want to be okay with. Like, go with the flow, man, might not really work for us here, right? The flow is looking pretty ugly. Good.
I think he just doesn't have a comprehension of what's right and what's wrong. And as far as hanging out with bad people, he hung out with the people that were around him.
Mhm.
He couldn't hang out with his boss, who owns a company who's a higher step above him. He couldn't hang out with the undertaker, people that have a purpose in life. Marceau just went from day to day, and he just didn't see the difference between what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, which might justify something like an insanity defense, having no sense of morality. But I think there's also something interesting in the juxtaposition of your comments here, that you go with the flow and yeah, you don't fraternize with people above your station. You just end up where you're at day after day. And it takes a kind of drive to raise yourself up and a kind of economic and social mobility, the ability to like move upwards, to not be caught up in the dregs, right? In the morally questionable and just terrible. And so this might be, if we want to attribute this kind of thought to Camus, might be Camus saying, like, look, the indifference that one might have, that sort of nihilistic conception of the world, the one that the world is meaningless, but it's enough for me to continue on in, is one that leads you down and at the bottom of the world in a way that will not cause good things. But it takes rebellion against the absurdity, not just being swept up in it to escape these terrible cycles, the cycles of people hurting each other to get there. And that's like total supposition, I don't know, but that might be something that would be consistent with Camus, an interesting idea. Mikey, and then William, and then we'll conclude. I'll give the end of lecture.
I definitely like the take you just suggested, more of like going with the flow versus not in the form of nihilism, isn't as passive as people might perceive it to be. But also just, I have to point out that the insanity defense is more about like you're present and you know what you're doing, and has almost nothing to do with like you know what you're doing is moral or not. Like if you know that you're killing someone and if you shoot at that person they will be dead, like you won't qualify. But that's just because I did a whole other thing about mental health and death row. But I thought it was interesting because as we're talking about him going with the flow and like these technically being immoral acts, like I'm pretty sure Ramon's, it's not his girlfriend. I'm pretty sure like Ramon is her employer because of the way like he pays for her things and the way he talks to her and the like he might be a pimp thing, and the fact that the Marceau still writes the letter or whatever. He goes through all these what a normal person might consider immoral or unethical acts, but I would argue that him shooting, at least the first shot he takes, is the most moral act he commits up to that point, because like we read into it and it definitely is self-defense. Like someone is coming at him with a knife and like he shoots them. Beforehand when he is talking to Raymond and he says like, oh, if the person pulls out a knife, like I'll shoot them for you, like give me the gun, like I got your back, like you don't need to be a part of this thing that you are definitely actually responsible for. Like he's continually, I think, showing episodes of like indifference to the point that he will take other people's consequences. And that when someone does come at him and when he does shoot this person at the spring, it's like the most moral act that he's committed so far, just because it's not something that he's not even responsible for. It's like, in my eyes, at least I read an act of self-defense into it. So I thought that was interesting, is that this turn that finally like leads him down this really terrible path is actually probably the most excusable thing he's done. Not the extra shots. I mean, we could also talk about that like in court and excuse it in other ways, but him taking the shot is the first time I feel like he's actually reacting to something in not a passive way.
Yeah, I might add to that, at least this is how I read it, like his relationship with Marie, he reacts to her in a not passive way, like the way when he kisses her, when he like smiles with her and all that sort of thing. But other than that, you're totally right. And I think it's an important distinction to make, and one that we haven't made yet, between the first shot and the second four. Right? The first shot might be one of self-defense, but then he turns the gun down and the body on the ground takes 4 more shots, right? And while we might think that guilt and indifference don't have a part to play in that first shot, it's just like the necessary reaction to someone attacking you. Those last 4 shots have an impact, right, on how we understand the character and how the world and the trial understands the character as well. So thanks for pointing out that it is a different quality of guilt in between the first shot and the last 4. William.
Hey, so I wanted to bring it back around. Interesting that we started on neurodivergence, and I'm probably going to try and bring it back around the neurodivergence a little bit. I would disagree with some of the takes I heard. So background, I'm a psychologist, and my specific interest is in behavioral disorders, especially emotion regulation disorders, right? And I'm not so sure. I guess the distinction has to be drawn between whether he's choosing to ignore emotions or whether he's actually able to feel emotions, right? Like the dictionary definition of psychopathy is that you have deficient emotional learning, you have a lack of empathy, you have poor behavioral controls. Often then you have antisocial behavior, criminal behavior, impulsivity. But it's not stemming from choosing to ignore your emotions, it's from actually not experiencing them, right? And a lot of what I see from this character in the book is someone who's he's recognizing his difference in that he's not experiencing these emotions in the same way that other people do, right? So, and as far as the insanity defense goes, there is a component of being able to distinguish between right from wrong. It varies from states. I mean, you know, the statutes are really kind of crappy in determining that. So I mean, for him to determine whether he's guilty or not. I mean, legally, depending on what state you're in and whether they put an insanity defense to it, he's probably guilty. But like morally guilty, it's kind of hard to hold him to that standard, I think, if he's not able to actually experience the emotions that are supposed to go with it. And you can even argue that like that's actually why he was found guilty, because he didn't experience any of those emotions. And when they put him on trial, he didn't, he could have gotten away with the whole thing. He could have talked about how he could have shown remorse. He could say he was grieving. He could claim he felt threatened. He could have emphasized that the guy brought the knife up. I mean, there's ways he could have done it, but it wasn't something he even thought of because he couldn't make the connection that what he did was actually wrong. Does that make sense? Now,
Yeah.
4 shots, that's another, the other 4 shots kind of throw a whole lot of ambiguity on it. But up to that point, it really looks like somebody who's really just struggling with the inability to experience their own emotions. And then, of course, you're just acting on instinct, logic, being tossed about by the wind and the forces, like a force of nature, like you were saying earlier. So I don't know. I think it's a little more up in the air.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool take. That maybe Meursault is unable to have the same feelings as other people. But I do want to like ask you, the 4 shots, that seems to me like a feeling, something human. Like you just tried to attack me, so screw you, or something like that, right? Like I'm mad and it's hot. I don't know what, but those other 4 shots, I think betray some kind of emotion or do
Yeah, right. It seems like at least that little bit of self-preservation, perhaps in the end, if in fact he felt threatened, right? Feeling threatened, feeling fear, it's still an emotion. But I mean, it's not that people who are struggle with like psychopathy and sociopathy, it's not like they don't feel any emotions, but they lack empathy. For sure. They lack that ability to perspective take and understand how their actions are hurting other people, So I think you could still show that kind of self-preservation from threat and not necessarily, still fit in that bit where you're having a difficult time with emotions and perspective taking of others.
Yeah, great. So we have an unempathic character who we, the reader, should have trouble feeling empathy for. Maybe we are, but like at least it's more challenging than like a regular novel character, right? To feel empathy for Meursault. And I think you're totally right that Meursault is on trial for being a stranger, for being an alien, for not having empathy, for not being empathic for others, for not accepting the empathy of others. But why is this, right? Why would Camus make this the main character? And I think the point is ultimately to say that all of this empathy stuff is just as much absurd as everything else. Even that like core feature, the thing that glues society together, that makes people love one another and able to work together and not be shooting each other on beaches every time it gets a little too hot, right? That like very human, as what we would understand to be very human feature of empathy is not present here.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you said earlier in the class about, but is he the one that's normal and the rest of us are crazy, right? Is it more normal and to be logical and not allow yourself to be confounded by emotions and feelings? Or is it better to, have a blend of the two? I think that's probably the question Camus trying to get us to figure out.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And in the space between the question and it's perhaps impossible to answer, we should hopefully begin to see or feel that absurdity, right? And the feeling of absurdity. Yeah.
This was just kind of my take of the 4 shots. It's probably could be wrong, but I was almost understanding it from this perspective that nothing matters. Having been active, being able to be active and actually shoot somebody and having some semblance of feeling, that the extra 4 shots were just in his mind that they didn't matter because the person was already dead.
Mm-hmm.
But he could do something. He could shoot 4 more times and just have a semblance of feeling and control. Is kind of how I understood it. Like that, it didn't really matter to him because the person's dead, and to him, he wasn't thinking that it'll be seen as overkill. The person's dead, and he'll be seen as killing them. But those 4 shots gave him, in that moment, like a feeling of control and activity, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of dark and scary to read it that way. It's like the son might have caused him to pull the trigger the first time, but then it was him that did it the last 4 times because of this need for control or something. Yeah, I think it's consistent. I think it's also pretty dark. And it just speaks to the empathy point, right? It's just the empathic qualities that Marceau doesn't have are striking here, and especially in the last 4 shots. Okay, so let's finish up lecture, get you out of here by 7. So the novel's conclusion. The second half of the novel tells the story of Marceau's jailing, trial, and eventual death sentence. Marceau is jailed, loses his freedom, and with it, his ability to remain indifferent to the world. The world's absurdity and its indifference to him is too oppressive for him to be indifferent to it. It forces him to wake up from himself and exist fully and authentically eventually. Marceau's trial happens without him as another expression of absurdity. His lawyer speaks for him using the word I when referring to his client, as if to take his identity, right? The events of the trial are almost entirely inconsequential to Marceau, who only really recognizes a few important events and the heat and the noise and the hustle and the bustle of the courtroom. The world goes on without him. And as his freedoms are slowly stripped away, so too is his ability to remain unattached and indifferent. He can no longer smoke when he wants to. He can't hang out with his girlfriend when he wants to. He can't swim or go for a walk when he pleases, right? He can't ride the bus at sunset as he likes to do. And yet he never forgets throughout this whole period of like this loss of freedom, the quote, Maman used to say that you can always find something to be happy about. And as a reader, it isn't until these moments when Marceau remarks in this way, and it happens several times that he remembers, you can always find something to be happy about, said Maman, that I begin to think that Marceau is perhaps not so unfeeling, not so unempathic. Maybe that he never in fact was, but it's just his empathy operates differently. His connection to the world humanistically operates in a different way from the sort that we've constructed a world around ourselves that makes sense to us. I think Marceau may not have been awake to these feelings, but they were always there. Maman died today. How striking that Camus chooses to use maman, right? Like mama or mommy, a childish endearment of mother. Marceau, who's described by his closest friend as a man. Everyone knows what I mean when I say that, right? Like testosterone, strong guy, doesn't speak much, wears sunglasses inside, a man, right? Calls his mother maman, mommy. The very same Marceau did not cry at his mother's funeral and who smoked and drank coffee irreverently over her dead body refers to her as a child would. They no longer had anything to talk about and they no longer expected anything from one another, and yet she remains his mama. Their relationship is completely estranged. They're 2 strangers living in an apartment that really can't fit 2 people, but still mama. And it's not until Marceau finally wakes up to the absurd of the factual state of the absurd world in which he exists, that he recognizes the factual state of the world's indifference to him and simultaneously feels that indifference deep in himself, as well as that Maman becomes his Maman. That is to say that she comes alive with her son, right? That I woke up to Maman not as just another entity living in the same apartment or in that old people's home, across town. But for the first time in a long time, I thought about Mama. I felt as if I understood why at the end of her life, she had taken a fiancé, Perez, right? Why she had played at the beginning again. Even there, in that home where lives were fading out, evening was a kind of wistful respite, so close to death. Maman must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. Nobody had the right to cry over, not even me, right? Her son. So you see Marceau in his jail cell and Maman in her home were each condemned to death. It's coming. Each was a stranger in their own worlds, disconnected from everyone and everything, no grip emotionally in the world, waiting furtively in near anxiety for the dawn to come, for the bell to toll or not to toll, and thus promise them another day of life. And as soon as Marceau has been jostled awake, alive by his altercation with the priest, who attempts to impose the greatest absurdity, so it seems, of all upon Marceau, the freedom of not caring about the present life anymore, because what comes after is what really matters and what really has meaning. Marceau says, no, I don't have time for that. I only have so much time. I only have until dawn to make these bricks that sweat with pain and suffering, to make it matter, to make it worth it. I only have until dawn to find value or purpose or rebellion in the jail cell wall, right? So don't waste my time with what comes after, because there's only hours left. And it's only after this altercation with the priest that Marceau recognizes what it means to call his mother mama, and what it is to be condemned not to death, but to a life in the absurd. Quote, as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time in that night, alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world, finding it so much like myself, so like a brother, really. I felt that I had been happy and that I was happy again. The internal feeling of absurdity and the factual state of absurdity are now in parallel in Marceau, in total alignment. Maman's words, you can always find something to be happy about, had never been more true than in this gentle indifference, this reflection upon the gentle indifference of the world. The next day, Marceau would be killed in front of a raging, hateful crowd, but none of that mattered. The extremity of the absurd would no longer cause his veins to bulge in his head, his finger to pull the trigger once, then 4 more times. No, he was happy. And next week we will read, what's the chapter? The Rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor. So the Grand Inquisitor is like the main passage. Rebellion, or I think it's Rebellion is the name of the chapter, is the one directly preceding it. Which is a conversation between 2 brothers, which starts like this argument about the problem of evil and how to like live in the world knowing that like evil exists, and dealing with the idea of God. Our 2 characters are Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov. Ivan being this like powerful intellect, and Alyosha being a like light spirited religious person. Innocent. Everybody loves Alyosha. And Alyosha is trying to like find redemption in the terrible thoughts of his brother. And in trying to redeem his brother through conversation, here's the most terrible thought, which is an argument and justification for his famous exclamation, "No, we'll return the ticket," which you read, you understand. And we'll discuss that next week. Next week will be similar. We'll do old-fashioned lecture notes, and then from that point on in the semester we'll do PowerPoint slides. So if this isn't your cup of tea, then PowerPoints will be coming. Yeah, so we have a little bit of additional religious thinking and absurdity and existentialism, and then we'll do a lot more in Kierkegaard, and then slowly work our way back towards Myth of Sisyphus, Sartre, and de Beauvoir. Okay, take care. Be well.
Thank you.